Welcome to the League of Women Voters and Town Meeting Member Association's warrant article discussion. Today we'll hear about two general bylaw proposals, a new bylaw for the town to provide language access services, and a bylaw amendment for the petitioner to provide financial impact explanation to a warrant article being submitted. The combined reports with explanations on all warrant articles are now available on the town's website, and the reports have analysis and recommendations in favor or opposition from Select Board, Advisory Committee, and other town committees. So on Article 15, it would add a bylaw to require that the town establish a language access program with translation services for individuals with limited English proficiency across all departments. If implemented, the town would become compliant with legal guidelines for federal ARPA funding. And we've talked about ARPA previously. It's the money that the town is entitled to receive from the federal government. Although in addition to the school department, a number of town departments also currently offer translation services, this article would require staffing and coordination for all town departments. An estimate for the cost is included in the warrant article. The Select Board and Advisory Committee have approved an amendment that does not require a permanent language access staff person. Article 27 is a bylaw amendment that would require that the petitioner of a warrant article describe the financial impact of its implementation. It follows a recommendation of the Brookline Financial Advisory Committee and is meant to provide town meeting and other town boards and commissions with information to inform decisions about a proposed warrant article. The Advisory Committee has proposed slightly amended language, quote, which shall to the extent practicable, which is intended to make it easier for a petitioner to become compliant. For all, this program is being recorded, and just a reminder, it's not a debate. Petitioners are asked to explain the intent of their article and to be prepared to answer questions. After the presentation, our speakers will take questions. Please, if you like, and you would like to, put your questions in the chat. And now we will hear first on Article 15 from Petitioner Chi-Chi Wu, a town meeting member from Precinct 7 and a member of the Advisory Committee. Chi-Chi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Betsy, and thanks for the introduction. My name is Chi-Chi Wu, and in addition to being a town meeting member in Precinct 7, I am the steering committee chair of the Brookline Asian American Family Network. Thank you all for coming this morning to hear about language access and warrant article 15. Warrant article 15 was developed by myself, co-petitioners Dr. Raul Fernandez from the Brookline Select Board, Mariah Nobrega, who's a school committee member and a town meeting member in Precinct 4, and the Brookline Asian American Family Network. We developed it after much consultation with both the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, as well as the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, most specifically the chair of the Immigrant Advancement Committee, Jessica Kiko. A little bit of history behind why we developed warrant article 15. Some of you may remember back in the spring, there was a terrible shooting in Atlanta where 8 people were killed. It was the first mass shooting during since the pandemic had started, and 6 Asian women were killed, and the shooter had targeted Asian women. And this was a culmination of a year of anti-Asian hate and racism stoked by, unfortunately, the former president. And after the shooting happened, there were some vigils and there were some statements from Select Board and School Committee, and there was a huge sign-on statement supporting the Asian American community. And we thought, Well, the statements are great and we really appreciate them, but we at the Brookline Asian American Family Network, or BAFN, thought it's time for the town and the schools to take concrete steps to support our Asian American community. After all, we are the largest racial minority in town, and preliminary census data indicates we are now close to 1 in 5 residents, 20% of the town. So in thinking about what the town could do to better serve the Asian American community, we thought, well, let's look at language access, because we know a lot of Asian American communities are limited English proficient, or LEP. So we looked at some data from the census. This is the 2019 American Community Survey, and it found that about 5,700 Brookline residents, or 10% of our population, is limited English proficient. Of those, the majority speak an Asian language, and they constitute about 6% of residents. There are also folks who speak, according to the census, an Indo-European language. We suspect most of those are either Russian speakers or Spanish speakers. This language access warrant article also includes some provisions about language access for those who are hearing or visually impaired. And we know that 7% of Brookline residents have a disability that might affect their ability to communicate. So we thought, well, it looks like there is a need there. And there's not just a need, but that need triggers certain legal requirements under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and Executive Order 13166, which was issued in 2000 and requires recipients of federal funding to develop a language access plan. Before that's done, to conduct a needs assessment that consists of 4 factors, and then to provide language assistance. In addition, the Americans with Disabilities Act also requires public entities like the town of Brookline to take steps to provide effective communications with persons with disabilities. So there's the legal requirement to serve LEP residents when there's federal funding involved, as well as disabled residents. So, as Betsy just mentioned, the town has gotten federal funding in the past, but we're about to get a lot of federal funding in the form of American Rescue Plan funds. And that really does create a heightened obligation on the part of the town to serve or make sure any services, any funding that is funded by this $43 million be provided for folks with limited English proficiency. And also, obviously, with this amount of money creates the opportunity to fund language access services. The Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations recently issued a draft of their disparity report. This is a report that town meeting voted to have conducted in the November 2020 town meeting, and language access was identified as one of the disparities. Despite this, the town doesn't have a language access plan. And town council has also recognized that our acceptance of the ARPA funds means we need to have a language access plan. So with that background, the petitioners drafted a warrant article that would require the town to provide language access services, and it would be part of the bylaws. It would require that 4-factor analysis that I mentioned earlier, and then the development of a language access plan. This whole process would be coordinated by a language access coordinator, which would be placed in the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. The original version of the warrant article had this as a full-time position. The advisory committee did amend this to strike the part about it being full-time. It would still be in the bylaws, but there would not be a requirement that it be a full-time position. The warrant article would also require each department that deals with the public to have someone in the staff be in charge of language access issues and to provide a budget line item in their budget for interpretation, translation needs, and also auxiliary aids and services for the hearing and visually impaired. It would require the town to conduct a survey of its employees for language accessibilities and who's willing to voluntarily provide them, and would also encourage the town to implement any other recommendations about language access in the disparity report. So estimated cost, there is an estimate of costs in the background. So the estimate that was printed in the combined reports and that we originally came up with was 200,000. 80,000 for salary and benefits of the language access coordinator, and 120,000 for interpretation translation services. This was, the 120,000 was based on what the schools spend for language access. So what I did was I looked at the school budget, and I looked at the item in the school budget for language access, and it's been 120,000 for the past couple of years. So, and this relates actually to the next discussion about cost estimates. So the advisory committee subcommittee actually did a deeper dive into cost estimate and came to the conclusion it's probably going to be a lot less, because there are some departments that are providing language access. It's not universal, and that's the problem. But the police department, the senior center do have language access services, and I know the library does. You know, the idea of petitioners coming up with cost estimates, we can do that. They may be really off. And in this case, they were probably way too high. So that's one of the things you want to think about for the next warrant article. But back to this warrant article. The other reason that the cost estimate might be high is now the requirement that the position be full-time has been struck. Although I'm hoping that it will be a full-time position, at least initially, when the language access needs assessment is conducted and the plan is formulated. And certainly that would be during the period we have these ARPA funds. As Bessie mentioned, the warrant article has been recommended favorably. School committee voted to support it, as did the advisory committee. There was an attempt to amend it to strike the requirement totally for the language access coordinator and for the line items in public facing town departments. That was rejected at advisory 8 to 8. Select board voted favorable action, as did the Commission on Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. And I guess we're taking questions after both presentations, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Oh, we can take them now. It can be both and before and after. Are there any questions from anybody? If you have something, you can raise your hand.
I have a question. This is Eva Balash Deutsch. Can you see? Can you hear me? So I recently retired from a healthcare position at Faulkner Hospital, and in the hospital we had two options for language services. One was an iPad that rolled from room to room where we could request services. I do not know the cost of such a service. And the other was telephone access. And again, I don't know for certain which telephone company or which telephone service it was, but it was a telephone translation service, interpreter service. I wonder if something like that is available or would be available to the town. Thank you.
So that's a great question, and thank you for raising it. Interestingly, at public comment at advisory and select board, one of the folks that spoke in strong support of this warrant article was a healthcare professional himself, and one of the things he pointed out that the town isn't doing adequately, for example, is promoting and making available certain services to LEP residents. And the example he gave was the flu clinic, where there wasn't any outreach in different languages, and we missed the opportunity to administer vaccines to those in our population who are LEP. So, and I know that the healthcare industry in general has been fairly advanced about providing language access, and it is because of the federal funding, things like Medicare and Medicaid that carry with it that language access obligation. So the mechanisms that you talked about, the language, telephone language access and interpretation by iPad, those would all be potential ways to provide language access. The Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations does have an account with a telephone translation line, and that line is occasionally used, but not a lot of people know about it, first of all, because obviously it hasn't been publicized to residents as a potential resource. Also, that the budget for that is fairly limited and certainly cannot support the needs of the entire town for language access services. So this is why we would want all town departments to have access to something like the telephone translation line, to have a budget for it. This warrant article doesn't specify what kind of language access, what documents, what services. That's the goal of having a language access plan. And the plan is not prescribed in the warrant article. The plan details are not prescribed. It's just its existence and development that are prescribed.
Any other questions? Yes, Carol, you.
Thank you. I worked at Beth Israel Hospital back when the town was seeing a tremendous number of Russian people arrive. And as we've been hearing, even more currently from Faulkner Hospital, it is possible to conduct a very good interview with a patient using the services that are available. Without it, we would not have been able to provide good healthcare service to the population we were seeing in those days. So it would seem that it might be really useful to utilize the contacts that we may have with those who have had some long experience doing exactly this. If we could make an attempt to be in contact with people who run those translation services in healthcare settings, we might learn a lot really right up front.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Carol. That's a terrific idea. I think we certainly want to call on all the resources we have available, including the great resources we have of nearby healthcare facilities and those within the greater Boston area. You know, as I said, you know, one of the strongest supporters of this has been Doctor himself, and he, you know, provided some background onto what was required of healthcare professionals. And it's really kind of eyebrow raising the night and day between what healthcare provides and what the town provides, which is very uneven, to say the least.
So Chichi, I also know that there are consulting firms or businesses out there that were, I believe maybe the school department uses, but I know that across the country, there have been a number of businesses created that will provide translation services. Are you aware of those as well?
Yeah, so some of those services are the telephone translation, and it looks like, you know, iPad translation, now video call translation. And certainly we would hope that that would be part of any language access plan. So for example, in a department that doesn't have any bilingual staff could take advantage of those. The example I always have been using is DPW. You know, you have a resident who is limited English proficient and doesn't have their trash picked up. In fact, this just happened to me on Wednesday, and I've used this example, and I'm really hoping that DPW isn't mad at me and didn't pick up the trash, but I just called them that afternoon to say, hi, my trash wasn't picked up. Easy enough. Imagine if you are limited English proficient, you don't speak the language of the person answering the phone. How do you communicate with them that my trash wasn't picked up? Can you come back and pick up my trash?
Exactly. Well, and the other thing for people with hearing disabilities, that's a whole nother level of need that involves hand, how should I put it, interpretation, which I don't understand. I hope there are ways of doing this I mean, theoretically, we could be doing it online, but it's very hard to do that for somebody who's got no visual contact in order to be able to understand whatever the statements being made are. Have you, well, that's going to be part of the study, I assume.
It will be part of the language access plan. The town does have an ADA coordinator, Sarah Kaplan, who was very, very helpful in us in helping us develop the warrant article, and also talking about the need. At the advisory committee subcommittee, for example, she talked about why there is a need for a specific coordinator position. And she talked about how when she started, there were very few ADA complaints, but because she is in the town, people know about her, disabled persons know about her, and she serves as a point person. You know, the number of complaints has gone up, and it's not because businesses or the town, you know, have gotten worse. It's because there's an awareness now that there's some place you can go to and say, you know, I couldn't, you know, get into a business because of lack of wheelchair ramp or such.
Right.
So, you know, she emphasized we really do need one person to go to, and that's why the warrant article, having a language access coordinator, is so important.
Got it. There's one question in the chat, which I think you've answered, but the question is, can ARPA funds be used to fund this program?
I certainly think ARPA funds can be used to fund this program. I mean, the whole reason we now have a heightened and greater obligation to provide language access is because we are receiving this large amount of ARPA funds. And you know, the initial outlay for things like developing a plan and conducting a needs assessment hopefully can be funded by ARPA, but that's not part of the warrant article. That's more of the background discussion. And, you know, I know there's a whole process for figuring out how to spend the ARPA funds, and we certainly did not want to interfere with that.
Absolutely, totally understand. Okay, well, thank you very much. Interesting to hear the thoughts about how we might implement this, and more to come clearly after we hear what town meeting decides. So thank you very much, Chi-Chi. And let's move on to Article 27, and John Doggett, if you would like to unmute yourself, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Betsy. Really do appreciate the invitation to speak on Article 27, and also to thank the League for holding these series of sessions, which is so important, I think, to your mission and informing the town in a more relaxed, perhaps, environment. And that's terrific. Thank you. I'm going to cover a little bit about warrant article, what it is and its legal underpinnings very briefly, and then get on to the article, our goals. We have 3 goals for it, and then I'll do a summary. So it shouldn't take me more than 3 or 4 minutes, perhaps, hopefully. Basically, a warrant article is the product of a petition by registered voters. And this is a fundamental right that we all have in the town, and it's governed by state law. And really very little is said about it except for one thing, and that is it's a right that's conditioned by a minimum of 10 registered voters. So any 10 voters can create a warrant article, or petition rather, which gets turned into a warrant article, which the select board has to accept. There is no turning back. There is no impeding that, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail, because that's an important part of this article. But there is a second law, essentially, a bylaw of the town that also underpins the warrant article process, and it's called the warrant article report requirement, which is technically 2.1.4. That's the actual number of the bylaw that we are going to amend, and we'll talk about the wording we're going to add to the bylaw for that amendment. And that amendment covers the requirement of the town, it is to the town, of any warrant article submitted should have an explanation. And as you see, it's quite common when you read the combined reports or any of the materials, it's usually always there. It's not required to be there by the state, but it's a request by the town in writing in the bylaws. And we're proposing to amend that particular aspect of the request. So the reason why we are putting this amendment forward, let me just say what the words are. They're very few words. So what we're proposing to add in the explanation of the requirement for the explanation, I'll just add the additional words, which is to include the financial impact to the extent practicable on the town of implementing the proposed change. That is to say that the particular warrant article should have some financial impact reference, and we'll talk about what that sum is, because that's a very important part of the consideration of our amendment. We basically have looked, what the problem has been historically is that a large number of warrant articles over time have had no financial information in them, and yet almost no warrant article is free. And particularly in the town's environment of increasing budget pressures, this is increasingly important, we believe, to have this as an expectation. Hopefully town meeting passes it, an expectation that town meeting expects some kind of financial information in the warrant article. I just, but as a comment on the Chichi and the previous warrant article, had indeed have that information in. That was terrific. That's what we want to see. What this article wants to see, what the petitioners would like to see, and we'll discuss the nature of that in a minute. The challenge of this article is to not increase the burden on a petitioner, so we don't deny the petitioner a right. For example, demanding some kind of very esoteric financial analysis, for instance, would be such, we believe, such a barrier. So that's the tricky line in which we're walking on this particular warrant article. So let me cover the three goals. We have a goal for the petitioner, we have a goal for the boards and committees that review these articles, and we also have a goal to not place an undue burden on the petitioner. So let me go through those very quickly. We want to, and the primary goal here is to raise awareness of the petitioner about the financial costs of the town of their proposal, and to describe the financial impact in general terms, whether or not the precise costs of the cost amounts are known at the time of filing. Obviously, the warrant articles are filed, like coming up for November here, are filed in September. And during that process, vetting goes on by boards and committees, such as the AC, depending on the article. Many different boards and committees sometimes are involved. And the goal here is to help those bodies, or remind those bodies, that the cost of the town is an important factor in the warrant article. It's not clearly not the only factor, but we're saying we would like to see an expression by the petitioners to the boards and commissions to help them guide that part of the input in their decision making on a particular article. Let me come to the undue burden, because that's really, I think, the crux of this article and the fine line which we walk. We believe that this article does not place an undue burden on the petitioner, and one of the reasons is, I've already explained, that it's not prescriptive. And some people criticize it on that basis, but if we feel that we need to leave it to the petitioner to decide what is important, what they can do, and what they can express, it's very important that remains in the petitioner's control and does not present a barrier. Just as a note on the barrier issue, even if the explanation is missing, there is no penalty for that. The select board cannot withhold the warrant article from going on the agenda on the warrant. So, sorry, the petition going on the warrant. I get my language right. And this has the same issue. It's a request. It's an expectation of town meeting if it passes, and the town meeting has an expectation, but that's it. It doesn't have to be. If it is missing, for example, there is no penalty. But we submitted this to town council to get town council's opinion, or associate town council's opinion, and they stated that as currently, I'll just give you a quote, as currently written, I do not believe that Article 27 conflicts with the state's statutory scheme for submission of town meeting articles. So in town council's opinion, this does not present a barrier. He goes on to add that the additional clause to the extent practicable, which was added and we believe a really good addition by the advisory committee to the extent practical. He says, additional clause to the extent practical is further proof that this article's requirements are meant to be applied in a way that avoids any conflict with state law, i.e. providing that barrier. We're not putting that barrier in place, he believes. So that encourages us, and that those words, the addition by the AC words, the words added by the AC are particularly important and really helped the article. We thank them for that. So just to recap, and I'll take questions, is that we'd like the warrant article explanation to include an estimate of financial impact of the town. This raises awareness in the petitioners of the financial impact of their warrant article. It also sets an expectation for reviewing boards and commissions to look into that and take that into account when they make their recommendations, and that we place no undue burden on the petitioner, as has been supported by the town council. And so just one final note that this warrant article does represent a modest step in satisfying the BFAC, the financial, I can't remember what the number that the acronym stands for now, Financial Advisory Committee, I think it was called, had a lot of recommendations. This is recommendation number 3 about warrant articles that they talked about. And this, we believe, represents a small step going along that road. So thank you very much. And I'm very happy to take questions.
Well, I'd just like to comment that the warrant article, particularly in relation to the language access article, is a very good illustration of both the, on the one hand, enormous ability for any citizen to access the town meeting. Getting a petition on, filing a petition for a warrant article requires 10 registered voters' signatures. It's not a huge barrier, and to have that opportunity available is something that is not true in other forms of government. And there are a lot of people who don't understand that. But that also ties very nicely into the hearing access article or the language access article, because it was written in such a way that it provides some financial information. Clearly, there's a lot more detail that would be developed over time. But I think the two of these together are very important ways of thinking about how our town meeting process works. And I'm very pleased to have them. We thought a little bit about this when we put them together, but I didn't realize they would work together as well as they do. So anyway, I'm sorry to have taken up the time, but if anyone would like to ask a question, you can raise your actual hand if you like, or make a, put up one of those little things on the screen. But I don't see anybody asking a question, and there's nothing in the chat. So then I guess where we are now is, Chi-Chi, do you have any follow-up comments that you'd like to make?
I don't have any more follow-up comments on the language access warrant article. Just, you know, if folks have any more questions, you know, on this warrant article 27, I know you don't want any debate. I just want to point out, while I did try to come up with a cost estimate, the cautionary tale is that according to the advisory subcommittee, it was way off, and it's still there in the combined reports. So, you know.
But the good news there is that it will be, has been reviewed, and in the town meeting, people will hear the corrections. So whatever was written into your original proposal, they'll hear that with further discussion and review, this information is now being updated to whatever people, you know, you're going to present, or advisory committee, whoever presents at the actual town meeting when it's debated. I guess I would say the way I'm tying these two things together is that probably there's some things that we try to do that have very little cost associated with them. They're policy, they don't have particular expenses. But there are other things that might be, and I think it's fair to say that perhaps your original estimate, which looked reasonable based on the fact that you were looking at what the school department did, if that turns out to have been high, then that's actually beneficial. So for that review to take place, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's processing things properly. Anyway.
Sorry.
Oh, and we've got a comment or a question over there. So hang on for a sec, John, and we'll get back to you.
Sure thing.
Carol, speak.
Yes, it sounds as if what we could use in Brookline is our own congressional budget office, which we are not going to get, I'm afraid. But what I am happy to see is some work that is going along with the recommendations of the Financial Advisory Committee. There are many recommendations there that have not been addressed, I think. And to see any step forward in the direction of improving our awareness of the cost of some of the actions that are being taken, this will be at least a step in the right direction. I'm very pleased that you put the article up.
And I think a reality check is really what we're talking about here, as opposed to let's just sort of have the idea, but the reality check is, can we do it? So John, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just, if I may just comment on Chi-Chi's comments, which are very to the point. And I think that we see it's a process, an evolving process. And that's why I particularly like the words "to the extent practicable" added, because at the time that the warrant article was submitted, that was the best effort attempt. As it goes through the process, more information, more heads are looking at it with different experiences. That all comes together, I think, in a better solution. And it may be higher, and it may, whatever is the difference, it doesn't really matter. But the process has worked in producing perhaps a better number, a more realistic number, but possibly. I don't know the details of it, but certainly I think that it's very consistent with what has happened with that article. Also, the petitioner, as you say, I think Betsy, you said that a policy may have no cost. In fact, this article, we would say, has no cost in one second, in dollars and cents, in terms of financial awareness of all the petitioners and boards and commissions, etc. That's hopefully a larger addition to our knowledge base when we discuss articles. So to just say, for example, the financial impact statement may say there are no financial costs associated with it. That's perfectly acceptable. And it may be that in the course of the process that we find that article does indeed have some financial and impact, and therefore that will come to light. And we come to light. So one other comment on the CBO, if I may. This was this has been discussed quite a lot, and where in the advisory committee, and where it should be, if it should be part of the administration, should it be part of the advisory committee? There's still the discussion is ongoing. I don't think that is resolved. There's no question that on large complex projects, for example, the heat pumps, $5 million expense, one would expect significant analysis and financial impact. And there, I think that was exemplary, that particular warrant article, in terms of its presentation and its analysis and its discounted cash flows, all of the appropriate financial measures. But the petitioners put that in because they knew that was a requirement, and I think that was very good. But if it wasn't put in, and they say, well, there is going to be an impact and it's going to be millions of dollars, even that would be helpful, because that would alert particularly the AC perhaps, or the school committee, whomever is reviewing that, to really sharpen their pencils and get a number on the table with the petitioner. Because I see from I'm part of the AC, obviously, and I see the dialogue between petitioner and review boards, particularly the AC in my case, as being absolutely critical and very, very helpful in getting warrant articles to town meeting that make sense, they're as accurate as the timing process can be in terms of financial numbers, for example. So I think we just have a much better process. The goal here is to help just remind everyone that financial impact of that warrant article is important, and that's what town meeting, if they pass this warrant article, would expect.
Right, and I'm just going to say, I think the impact is important. Understanding the cost of things that we may consider to be very desirable and then have a hidden cost that nobody knew about is very important for everybody. And I would then sort of go to the technical part a little bit here, which is to say the language access program is actually can be very significant because of this very large amount of federal money that will be available to the town in order to be in compliance with federal regulations. And that's part of why, as an illustrative example of warrant articles, these two have a very important way of helping people understand that we put things before our town meeting to vote on, and the level of information and understanding behind them is critical and important and detailed. And knowing that ARPA funds could, in fact, be affected, their availability, by whether or not we're in full compliance with federal regulations, as well as knowing what the cost might be, because if it were instead of $1,000, $100,000, that would be a big deal in terms of how we would be able to consider things. All of that's important to the decision-making process. And my view is the more information we have, the better equipped we are to do the right thing. So anyway, okay, well, I thank you both, really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody else. This has been recorded and will become available over the next maybe 2 days to be downloaded if anybody else would like to review it. So we thank you all, and we hope to see you again at another Friday morning.